All right, everybody. It's Brother James here. I figured I'd give a short testimony of my becoming a Christian and also how I became Eastern Orthodox, or more commonly referred to as Orthodox, especially since we're here in the West, in the Americas. So basically, when I was a young child, my up until maybe 8 or 9, my family didn't attend any sort of church congregations, and I basically lived fairly secular. On Sundays, I'd try to play baseball or do stuff outside, and when my mom started going to church again, I kind of wiggled my way out of going to services a few times, been like, oh, I'm going to play baseball or wiffle ball or whatever. And eventually I ended up going to the Baptist congregation that my mom was attending, and my mom has since then become a devout Baptist, and as well as my sister. But for myself during that time period, although I was baptized into the church, it didn't kind of really set in, it didn't really affect my heart much. My mom did teach me some of the basics of the scriptures. She would do Bible studies with my sister and I when we were younger. And then also after like maybe a short, maybe 1 or 2 year period of doing that, my dad took me to the Methodist church where he had kind of gone and been raised. My grandfather on my dad's side was Methodist. This was also in the 90s, so during that time period, they still had a traditional Methodist service at the congregation where we went, and it's there that I learned how to do the Lord's Prayer and memorize the Lord's Prayer. And maybe shortly after that, they kind of had some of the liberalization, and some of the people that were there, my dad didn't really get into the homilies or the lectures, the preaching, and so we ended up stopping attending there. And that was probably maybe when I was 14 or so. So from like 14 until maybe my junior year, or maybe even my senior year of high school, I was basically living a secular life. Although I would probably say that I would have said that I would have believed in God if somebody asked me. I didn't really practice anything. I wasn't praying, wasn't reading the Bible. And it wasn't until my latter part of high school that I was introduced to creation science and some of the conspiracy theories that got me interested in just reading. And that was primarily through a language arts teacher that I had in high school. He would talk about weird stuff about like Hitler's obsession with occult, and he would also talk about creation science, which fascinated me. So I started reading books probably for the first time. Although I was interested in herpetology, which is the study of reptiles and amphibians, and way back when The Crocodile Hunter was on, Mark O'Shea, I would read that sort of stuff. But in terms of the faith, this was the first time that I actually was interested in Christianity. And it's during high school that I actually read through the Bible for the first time, at least the Protestant canon of the Old and New Testaments. And then after that, so during that time period, I started going back maybe a few months with my mom to the Baptist congregation that was near our house. And it wasn't very long before I started attending the Charismatic congregation that my girlfriend at the time had attended since she was young. So that congregation was basically comprised of people that were that became Christians during the Jesus movement in the 70s, when a lot of the hippies became Christians. And so it was through these people that I kind of had my spiritual formation, or kind of like the bulk of my my Protestant upbringing was in that group. So basically, not only that was that, so that was Charismatic, but then we also would have like joint services with other groups as well, like Pentecostals, which are very similar to Charismatics. So basically non-denominational as well. And so that was kind of my experience before becoming Orthodox. And so it's kind of that background that I would like to talk about from an Orthodox perspective to help other people that are Pentecostals or Charismatic or non-denominational that have questions like about Orthodoxy. I hope that I'd be able to answer some of these questions, because a lot of the YouTube channels now that are out there have great resources, great intro to Orthodoxy, great apologetics, great catechesis classes or catechism classes for catechesis. And one thing that I notice has been lacking is sort of like answering people's questions on, what's the Orthodox position on, the spiritual gifts, stuff like that, where a lot of the Orthodox might have an opinion or be able to answer that question, but they don't necessarily understand where somebody's coming from a charismatic or Pentecostal background. So it's kind of like the questions will be lost because of a misunderstanding of the person that's trying to give the answer. And so I guess fast forward, so in the Charismatic Church, like I said, that was most of my spiritual formation, and it was the congregation that I was attending at the time. I had a minister there that ended up going to Metro Christian Fellowship, which was at the time basically kind of the precursor to what would eventually turn into the International House of Prayer in Kansas City with Mike Bickle. And it's through listening to some of the lectures of Mike Bickle that I was introduced to kind of interior prayer, contemplative prayer, mystical prayer, whatever you want to call it. Although Orthodox have a very specific set of terms that they normally use for that called hesychasm. That's kind of what I was exposed to, and that really struck a chord with me, as much so probably as when I was hearing about creation science for the first time. So I was fascinated by finding out that there's people who did not believe in Darwinian evolution and actually held that the Earth was actually much younger than billions of years, that it was only like in the thousands of years old. So I started reading a lot of those creation science books. But then after I became familiar with that stuff, I moved on to kind of the more spiritual reading from the charismatic background. And basically, after being in that culture, or you could say that church life for a while, I kind of started to notice that there were some things that I felt were off scripturally, and also just kind of I'll go into it a little bit, I guess. So basically, one of the teachings that they had at the International House of Prayer was basically that you're learning to prophesy so that they encourage everybody to prophesy and just to get better at it. And so what you would actually have is you'd have a lot of people that would either just say super vague stuff that was comforting, or trying to encourage people, or sometimes you'd have people that would say stuff that's just blatantly false or is even heretical. Like, for example, one of the major one of the major prophetic influences of the International House of Prayer, his name was Bob Jones, and he told one time of how he had an experience, and I think it was a high priest is what he thought it was in the dream, and this high priest came to him and he says, and it says, "Do you know who I am?" And he's like, "Well, I know you're Jesus, but I don't know who," meaning like what sort of manifestation Jesus was taking as I assume what he was meaning that to be. And basically he goes on to say that this spiritual being tells him that every year on the Day of Atonement that Jesus comes and offers up it's supposed to be Jesus, offers up his blood, guaranteeing Christians one more year of life. And that really conflicts with the scriptural account where Christ offers himself up once for all. There's no sort of continuing sacrifice, because if there's a continuing sacrifice, there's no longer putting away of sins. I think that's all in Hebrews. But anyway, so like after that, I'm like, well, this is really off. And also I had my own my own spiritual experiences, because in in those groups, you're really encouraged, like, oh, you got dreams, you had a vision, run with it, it's God. And so there's not much discernment. And so eventually, fast forward a couple of years, I ended up having some kind of weird spiritual experiences that led to a period of despondency that lasted about 2 or 3 years. And after the 2 or 3 years, I kind of realized that most of the stuff that I experienced was not of God. It was not godly. And primarily, a huge way that I figured this out was also through the testimony of St. John, where that every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is of God. So basically, if you have some sort of being coming to you in dreams or visions or whatever, you can ask it if it believes, or if it testifies that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh, because a demon will not testify that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. And it's primarily through that I realized that most of these experiences that I was having were not godly. So fast forward, I came out of that. Then I kind of had before that I kind of had hey, everything's got to have this specific, I got to have an answer for everything. And the fact that I didn't have an answer for a lot of these experiences that I had bothered me. And that's part of the reason why I got so messed up for so long. But after that, then I kind of started to have more of well, maybe I can just not know something. And so kind of leaving things as a mystery was learned through the trial that I went through. And so basically, after that, kind of reinvigorating my spiritual life, after that period of despondency, I started reading about the history of kind of interior prayer and how that developed, because I was kind of trying to look at what Mike Bickle was teaching, which I borrowed, although at that point I was no longer really going to those groups because of their encouraging people to just prophesy at random. And a lot of these people just blatantly false prophesy. They'll say, something's going to happen in 2 years, and then, 2 years go by, and then that what they said was going to happen doesn't happen. Or like I said previously, they tell of this experience of this spirit that they saw in a dream, and that spirit's teaching stuff that's blatantly heretical. So after kind of leaving those groups, I started to do research on contemplative spirituality, and then also comparative religion studies. So I'd look at, okay, what do the Protestants, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox all believe on, say, salvation? What do they believe on in terms of grace? What do they believe in terms of, X doctrine? And so it's through that I kind of became familiar with Eastern Orthodoxy. And it's primarily also through studying about the interior prayer, the different, you could say, different perspectives of interior prayer that I also encountered Eastern Orthodoxy in a profound way. Because so basically there are very few Protestant groups that actually had any sort of developed interior prayer. So Mike Bickle primarily took it from Roman Catholicism. I had issues with Roman Catholicism, and some of the spirituality in those groups just didn't feel right to me at the time. And now I can, explain a lot of that stuff doctrinally. But and also I disregarded the idea that the Pope was infallible or the head of the church. So that obviously led me to not pursue Roman Catholicism. But then I encountered, maybe on the one hand, I had, I think it was Quietism, Madame Guyon, and then basically kind of what seemed anyway kind of like the spirituality that I had been practicing. And then the other one that was kind of similar but definitely different was Hesychasm, which is the Eastern Orthodox spiritual practice of interior prayer. And it's through studying these things that I primarily decided to become Eastern Orthodox. With Madame Guyon, she basically kind of taught an absorption into God, which after reading a couple of her books, I was like, well, this is completely wrong, because I didn't believe that you get absorbed into the essence of God, which I'm pretty sure she taught. At least that's what it seemed to be with some of the writings that I read from hers. So I started looking at hesychasm, and kind of strangely enough, one of the first books that I read was Gregory Palamas, his book The Triads, which I think I have back here somewhere. Yeah, which is a great book. I wouldn't necessarily recommend a beginner to read this because it's pretty, it's kind of highbrow in terms of the theology it talks about. So basically, I ended up, it was around 2013 that I ended up studying Orthodoxy. And my first service was a morning prayer service, and I went and talked to the deacon and the reader that were there for that service. And we talked for like 2 or 3 hours, and it was a really great time. And then I started attending more and more services at that point, and then eventually I decided I was going to become Eastern Orthodox. So then I think in 2014, I think the spring of 2014, I became a catechumen. And then I think it was 2015, Holy Saturday of 2015, I became Orthodox. I was received in through by Charismatic. So now I've been Orthodox for basically about 6 years. So although I really have some holes that I need to work on in terms of my ability to explain all the dogmatic things in Orthodoxy, it's such a huge tradition that I hope to be able to explain some of this and be able to translate that to inquirers that are coming from a Pentecostal or maybe a Charismatic background. So my future videos, I hope to do stuff like, okay, what are the Orthodox sources for what we believe about speaking in tongues or the gift of prophecy, and all that sort of stuff. So stay tuned. Subscribe if you would like. And if you also have questions that you'd like me to answer, put them in the comments section, because maybe I can start working on videos for some of those. So this is basically the first video in 10 months that I've done. And so I kind of want to kickstart the stuff, especially since, speaking to these specific topics aren't really being covered that I know by anybody on YouTube. So anyway, that's all I have, and I hope to do another video soon.